Similarly, I believe that the SBA has to lobby the government of Barbados to be able to create a holistic environment, a holistic and user-friendly environment for funding. And why am I using that phrase? We all address the issues of funding and financing. You say small businesses, and most people talk about funding issues straight up. But the truth is that I don't think we have ever developed a holistic approach to it. And let us ask ourselves some difficult questions. Is a commercial bank or a credit union the appropriate entity to take the high risk usually associated with startups of new businesses? Now, in a sense, we recognize that, and we put some dedicated funding agencies, all governments, from the BDB right back through to Fund Access, Enterprise Growth Fund, etc. But the holistic environment that I'm talking about, and the user-friendly environment, the recognition of being able to graduate enterprises to other levels of finance, be it debt, and not only simple debt, but also secondary market with different instruments to facilitate access to debt, equity. Has there been that holistic approach that brings all of the players together and all of the players understand where they stand in relation to the mission at hand, which is taking a population, 90% of whom had no capital at the point of independence, no inherited capital, but who today are being relied upon to be the engine of growth for our own development. And those are some serious issues that have to be addressed. The truth is that the range of instruments has to be broadened as well, similarly because what may be appropriate for one entity may not be for another. The problem is the high costs associated with broadening that range of instruments because of the small size of the market. And this is where the CSME has to be able to also offer an opportunity to us in terms of being able to allow the movement of capital, not just for the benefit of large enterprises who believe that is their right, but for you to start to recognize, how can I utilize this single market and single economy to my benefit in terms of the movement of capital and the widening of access to markets and goods and professionals to be able to enhance my product. The truth also is that many of the approaches that we have in relation to accessing funding are too bureaucratic, not user-friendly, and more often than not turn people away from using what is there for us. And that description, I'm told, may well attach to the new factoring program that was launched on the 1st of December. Because if you have to produce your financial statements and history, when the real problem is not your financial health, but the ability of the person who has bought the goods and services to be able to pay. And therefore, why are you focusing on the provider of the service when it is in fact the purchaser of the goods or service that in fact needs to be able to show their ability to pay if a bill is going to be assigned for someone else to collect? And I think, therefore, and I say this not in an acrimonious way at all, but that we may need to revisit the criteria surrounding the factoring program, because it took 18 months to get off the ground, and having gotten off the ground, its shape and structure is not in any way attractive to the persons who most need the benefit of the factoring services, particularly in selling services and goods to government whose liquidity is already tight. And when you have any alternative to face overdrafts at 16 and 18%, and I can speak with authority now, you then know exactly the nature of the dragon that you're facing. Similarly, as I said, there must be an approach that allows us to be able to also look and see whether after years across both governments, whether the location of the credit guarantee schemes in the central bank is a user-friendly location for most small, nano and small enterprises. I say not, I felt not then, I still feel not. And I think that those are some of the things that we can do that will not necessarily cost a large amount of money, but will greatly enhance the attractiveness of the product offerings that we have in terms of finance already. Similarly, I feel strongly that there has to be a dedicated institution to support exports in this country. We restructured, both governments again, BIDC in 91, 92, 93, we did as well, and then we established Invest Barbados. Invest Barbados was always intended to focus on services and investment, but that there was to be another entity to complete the trilogy, and that was Export Barbados. And Export Barbados was to focus exclusively on the export of goods. When people come to work every day to make something happen, then it begins to happen. When their energies are diffused and you have a scattershot approach, it does not happen. And one of the first things that we looked at for Export Barbados to be able to do, how do we expand existing export markets with existing suppliers? How do we get new suppliers into existing markets? And how do we get existing suppliers into new markets? Most entities within the small and medium-sized sector in Barbados do not have the capital, the money, to be able to do the research, to be able to benefit from those export opportunities. In the same way, therefore, that the Barbados Tourism Authority plays a vital role to support the marketing of tourism establishments, thereby reducing some of the costs that would otherwise be outlaid by that particular hotel, we need an entity that is capable of reducing the outlay that would otherwise have to be incurred by an exporter of goods in this country. And I therefore say that the need for Export Barbados is urgent if we are going to reposition ourselves in terms of benefiting, particularly within the niche markets, of exports of goods. And finally, I believe that you have to also ask government to recognize that as they resolve their own issues in relation to the appropriate size and structure of government, because there is no doubt in my mind that business cannot continue as is in this country in terms of the role and structure of government. We have reached a point where our desire to be able to allow everyone to benefit at all costs is not being supported by what we earn, both nationally and what government can earn. And the truth is that we have, therefore, as a country, to have that conversation that allows us to have at least a consensus on what is it that we want to continue with. I know what my views are, and they're very strong, but you have different views, you have different views, you have different views. Where does the consensus lie? And it is necessary to achieve that consensus in order for us to have a relatively agreeable population, because change will trigger dissatisfaction in certain sectors. Now, I made the point earlier today that of our transfers and subsidies, if you look at expenditure between 2002 and 2008, wages grew by about 200 million, but transfers and subsidies grew by more than double. 51% of our transfers and subsidies are to the hospital, QEH, and to the University of the West Indies. Critical institutions in our psyche and for our living. But if we're going to continue to support them, then we can't continue to support the other 49% in the same way. No problem. And I am for supporting them, but bringing about greater efficiencies. It therefore means that there are going to be opportunities available, in my view, if we are to sustain ourselves as a country, that ought to be made available to small entrepreneurs as well. Now, the government can go and borrow and borrow and borrow as it has been doing, making our macroeconomic position highly unstable. Or it can say to the Barbadian public, mobilize your savings and invest and help us stabilize this country. I have said over and over, there is no reason for a government to own a transport board. You have 250 government buses and you have 500 privately owned public sector vehicles. There's no reason for government to raise money to buy another government bus, not with 500 small entrepreneurs owning vehicles. Now, there may be issues as to how they operate, and we can deal with that. But the reality is the investment is sunk. There is no reason for government to own an airport or a seaport. And the savings that I'm talking about mobilizing are your national insurance, your social security funds, your pension funds, your credit union funds, and then your individual savings, probably capped at a certain level so as to ensure that there's no consolidation of ownership in a few hands within the opportunities that will be made available. Many of these enterprises operate monopolies or are one of few players in the market and are services that a country will always need. And who better to own them if the government is having trouble dealing with everything than ordinary Barbadians such as yourselves through the enterprises and through the opportunities that you have created. So that I believe that the SBA has to be in the forefront of lobbying to create space for small and medium-sized entrepreneurs in this country as we undertake the discussion of reconstruction of our government, which is an economic necessity if we are to keep our heads above water. And as I say that, I also make the point that at the same time, our national insurance scheme represents the pool of savings of us collectively. And that is why I am at odds or at pains to understand why the NIS would want to sell its shareholding in Barbados Light and Power, since there are so few opportunities available for long-term return and long-term investment in this country. And the one thing a social security scheme does need is a diversified pool of investments, including long-term investments, if it is going to be able to make the returns to you at 30, when you make 67, it is now, 30, 40, 50 years down the line. So that is something that, well, concerns me. So finally, ladies and gentlemen, there's a role for each of us. There's a role for us as entrepreneurs, and there's a role for government. Government is not the sole entity responsible for transforming your fortunes, and you are not the sole entity responsible for transforming theirs. But your future depends on your actions, both for your enterprises, and our future as a whole depends on your actions individually and collectively. And until we accept that we have reached that date with destiny in our history, where we can no longer look back and blame, where we can no longer look across and point a finger, but where the determination of whether this is a prosperous society and a just society is determined not by someone outside or not by a monolithic structure alone called government, but by you individually as small entrepreneurs making the decisions that help you provide for your families primarily, but which ultimately collectively helps us to provide for our country and our future prosperity. And I trust and hope that we will open our minds to be able to make those cultural changes first, those psychological changes, to create the relationships with others, to develop the synergies both locally and outside that will help transform, and to be able to speak in a forthright manner, recognizing that we should not be bound by the sociology of small development, which says that if I speak out, I'm speaking against somebody rather than speaking on an issue that disagrees with somebody. And it is a hurdle that we are to overcome, because it is only when all voices contend that we can determine what is the appropriate consensus and what is it that unites us to move forward as a people, recognizing that if the nation succeeds, each of us will succeed. Thank you. God bless.